I've been teaching at James Madison College. This is my 14th year, and I'm also directing the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, and we were happy to wanted to do something this week to honor the 11 congregants of the Tree of Life Synagogue who were murdered the past Saturday on October 27th, and those injured as well. And we also wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on why this happened and the context for it happening, and anti-Semitism and what meaning we can bring from it. We are kind of seeming to be living in an age where hate groups are cropping up everywhere, and there seems to be greater legitimacy to give into hate speech, whether it's by mainstream politicians and also galvanized by social media. And we just feel bombarded by this, I think, on all sides. I think just, there was a attack in a largely African-American church in 2015, and then just this week as well, didn't get as much attention, but there was an attempt at an African-American church that was racially motivated, and I think they couldn't get in, and then they killed 2 people at a store nearby. You have attacks on mosques and on Sikh places of worship, and possibly the recent attack at the yoga place may have been motivated by hate and racism and misogyny. So we're just at the breaking point, it seems like, in terms of hate speech and hate violence. And we wanted to take the opportunity to kind of find support and solidarity with one another in the face of this, and examine a particular kind of prejudice. Last year, we all came together, and our institute organized one of the panels at the residential college teach-in the week before Spencer came to our campus, in an effort to, again, all these groups come together to celebrate both diversity, but also look at the different forms of discrimination and prejudice and hate in our country. Last spring, also right here in the Madison Library, we had a panel that Jewish Studies and Muslim Studies co-sponsored to look at both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I think we want to continue to do the work of working together with all these groups and forming alliances. I think because this was the most deadly anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history, we wanted to also take the time to reflect in particular on this community, on the people themselves, and on this particular prejudice, and take an hour to actually discuss that in full, rather just in 5-minute spurts. But we very, very, very much appreciate all the support we've gotten across campus, not only from the College of Arts and Letters and James Madison College and the Residential College of Arts and Humanities and the College of Social Science and the History Department, the Department of Religious Studies and the Peace and Justice Program and the MSU Museum, but also the African and African American Studies Program, the Chicano and Latino Studies Program, the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Program, the Muslim Studies Program, the American Pacific Studies Program, the Office of Intercultural Inclusion and Intercultural Dialogue, and also the Engagement Office in Madison that includes that. And so for many of you, there was a student-initiated vigil the day after the attacks. I think there were about 250 people there, most of the students, but members of all different communities. And it was really moving to see all that support. A local synagogue Thursday evening, Shalom Tzedek, with another local synagogue, and an interfaith council, including the local imam and local priests and ministers, all came together in support and to speak against hate speech. And that's what we're trying to do this evening as well. We feel that support from 18 or 19 units across the university, and some of you probably heard about this through those programs, and we really appreciate your being here. The reason we're paying extra attention to this today is not only the shootings at the synagogue, which is the main catalyst, but it seems like we just have a wave of anti-Semitism that's documented by the Anti-Defamation League that has spiked 60%. over the past year, and in college campuses doubled over the last couple of years. If you look at FBI hate crime statistics, about 30% are targeted against religious groups, and Jews among them have been the main target for over a dozen years, often between 65 and 75% of attacks. There are about 2 incidents a day, and so just this week, after the shooting attacks, you had graffiti in synagogues in Brooklyn and in California saying "Kill all the Jews." A senior citizen Jewish woman was attacked through a hate crime in Cambridge, Massachusetts this week. There were all kinds of horrendous graffiti everywhere. And so the list just goes on in this draining way every day, and that's why we're taking the time to really focus on it more fully today. We have an amazing panel here. Professor Margot Valles from Religious Studies and from the English Department and the Serling Institute of Jewish Studies is from this community, went to the synagogue every Saturday and is going to tell us about the community. David Middleman, who's a local lawyer who's on the board of our institute, and I'm also proud to say represented over 100 victims of Nasser this past year. Also grew up in this community and will talk to us about the community. We have Amy Simon, our Farber Chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History, who's a professor in James Madison College, the Institute, in the History Department. She teaches on anti-Semitism, and she's going to be talking to us about historical tropes, also anti-Semitism in Europe. I think then Laura Yaris, who's our Judaism professor in religious studies and in the Institute, will be talking to us about bias, right? As we all know, one of the triggers was that the synagogue was working to help and welcome refugees through working with this organization. We'll have Professor Kirsten Vermeglish, who's in the History Department Institute and teaches about American Judaism and American culture, and her book just came out on aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism and name-changing. She'll be talking about hate groups in the 1930s and giving us a historical perspective. And then I'll be talking about different aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism. And Ken Walzer, who taught here at James Madison College for 43 years and directed the Jewish Studies program and taught this anti-Semitism class for 43 years, will kind of bring broader perspective to how we can make meaning today of this. So stay with us. I know it's not, it's a heavy topic, but we really appreciate you being here to support. So, Margo.
Sorry, I'm just setting my timer so that I make sure that I don't cut out other people's time. So there's a joke, and it's not a very funny one, but there's a joke about the Jewish Robinson Crusoe who was on a shipwreck and ended up on a deserted island and was there for many months. And when finally rescue team came, they were amazed to see that he had built up the entire island. He had a workshop, he had a kitchen, a separate building for his bedroom, a separate building for his bathroom, a separate building for his synagogue. But there was one building he didn't show the team. And eventually they asked him, "What building is that?" And he said, "Oh, that's the synagogue I never stepped foot in." So that's the stereotype about Jews and Jewish communities, that there's so much division. Even when there's one person, there always has to be a place that they refuse to step foot in. But Squirrel Hill, even though there are 10 synagogues within walking distance of the home where I grew up in, and that's not counting synagogues and congregations that share space, and that's not counting congregations that meet in houses that haven't been recognized as full-blown synagogues, and that's not counting all kinds of other Jewish organizations that exist in the neighborhood. It's the type of community where people have multiple memberships, they belong to multiple synagogues, they attend functions at their friends' and neighbors' houses of worship, and a couple things to mention about the community that exemplify this. I went to a school for advanced Jewish studies, which is a community-wide after-school Hebrew school, and had teachers from the Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, and Hasidic movements. There's a community day school that largely functions in the same way, and we've seen that unity in the pictures and articles that have come out of Squirrel Hill since the event, but the things I'm saying about my own childhood and also what I'm about to show you show that this unity was there before this tragedy occurred. In this image from 2010, the Tree of Life congregation, which had once been part of Rodef Sholem, which is the big Reform synagogue in town, and broke off in 1865. Tree of Life broke off in 1865, and was Orthodox for a while, and then adopted conservative principles and joined the conservative movement, adopted yet another conservative congregation into its fold in 2010, Or LaSimcha, and now it's Tree of Life Or LaSimcha. They also host another congregation, Reconstructionist congregation called Dor Chadash. And this was the image celebrating the union of the congregations. And on the far left, the gentleman holding the Torah that's most to the left is Dan Lager, my parents' good friend, and the person who was shot in the stomach and is still in the hospital, though he's on the road to recovery. And his wife, Ellen, is holding an edge of the chuppah in the front left as well. With my remaining time, I want to talk about how this impacts everyone. People that I wouldn't have expected. So my friend Mick Garber, who went to high school with me, his little brother has Down syndrome, and he attends Tree of Life. And the two brothers who were shot were his caretakers. And so here we have a story of somebody who didn't expect to be losing, whatever, okay. Also, my uncle Sam, who's lived in Arizona for the past 30 years, wrote a beautiful memorial of Rose Mallinger, who was the 97-year-old who died, and her family with whom my dad and his brothers grew up. And in fact, my Uncle Charlie has flown to Pittsburgh to be with their family, with the Mallinger family as they mourn. Rose Mallinger's funeral was just Friday because they were waiting for her daughter, Andrea, to get out of the hospital. She was shot in the arm. And so they delayed the funeral until she was able to join them. So these two people were posting, which I wouldn't have expected. But then this person posted, and this person posted, and this person posted. It ends up being everyone I know, basically, was impacted by this event. And I think everyone who's from Pittsburgh and in Pittsburgh, and of course, Jewish communities and larger communities all around the world have felt connected to this tragedy and have felt something. But I want to highlight the way that Pittsburgh in particular has reacted, which has been amazing, between what the mayor said on the day of and the following day, but also what the sports teams have done with their logos. And in Pittsburgh, the sports teams are really a unifying, you know, if you're a fan, it helps bring you closer to all of your neighbors. And it moved a lot of people around the world when the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had as their headline the first verse of the Mornis Kaddish in Hebrew and in English. So that's it for what I have to say about the community. And now I'm going to pass it over to David, who's also from Squirrel Hill.
Good evening. As Margot said, on October 27th, Rose Mallinger, age 97, was murdered by a coward simply because she was Jewish. I didn't know her personally. I'm sure I met her, but the reason I know her is I played basketball with her son, Al Mallinger, who we called Mal, all through high school. And when I would see Mal, when I would return from time to time to Pittsburgh, although we don't keep in touch, the smile, the bonding that we had in the community was quite incredible. We played at the Pittsburgh JCC, Jewish Community Center on Forbes. He lived across the street. The two brothers that Margot mentioned, Cecil and David Rosenthal, were younger than me. The rest were older, on average, 74 years of age. I'm 62. When I left Squirrel Hill as a young pharmacist in '81, I believe they were customers of mine. The only way anyone and everybody has described these two young men, brothers, was that they were loving, mildly impaired people that were nice, caring, respectful, and helpful. They were what we call mensches, good people. The reason I'm familiar with all 11 names is while Pittsburgh is a big city, Squirrel Hill is a small town. And everybody knows each other, or at a minimum, somebody who knows somebody. The high school that I attended, Taylor Alderdice, is approximately a mile from the Synagogue. I graduated in 1974, my dad in 1950, his sister in 52, and my sister in 76. Our senior class president, Lou Weiss, wrote an article last week, "A Melech Comes to Pittsburgh," in the Wall Street Journal. It was pretty good, not nearly as good as the several articles his daughter, Barry Weiss, wrote in the New York Times. The first, is that right? Wow, she's brilliant. The first one, "A Massacre in the Heart of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood," and the reference is because Mr. Rogers lived 3 blocks from the synagogue. The more recent one is "When a Terrorist Comes to Your Home." And I urge you to just Google Barry, B-A-R-I, Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. But more important than the 2 articles that she wrote was the interview she did with Bill Maher. And if you Google Barry Weiss and Bill Maher, you'll hear a great conversation about what occurred, and it kind of put things in perspective for me. But before I get to what I got from that great interview, I recently learned from Rabbi Hendel Weingarten how to best confront the hate and haters, and that is by what Margot was saying, unifying. It's happening, it has been, but now it has to be more. We have to do more good to overcome or wipe out the bad, and we have to overcome the darkness by shining the light. But why did it happen? How did it happen? What does it mean? I believe, and if you look at some of the writings out there, it has to do with envy, which can be the root of evil. Why the Jewish people? Why? Because perhaps what the Bible says or the Torah, we're the chosen people, likely. We're also, because pound for pound, perhaps, if you look at what a relatively small size of people has been able to accomplish, the magnitude. But Barry makes some sense, very important sense in her observations. It's easy for a bully to pick on somebody weak. While Israel and the Jewish people are not weak anymore and have never been stronger. That of it itself is threatening to a bully. So the dangers of the current administration and the price that we may have to pay because of some of the policies that some Jews, some Republicans, some Democrats may like are expensive. And when I'm talking about policies, I'm talking about the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, or abrogating some of what happened with the Iran deal. But the price that we pay for making these policy changes is giving up our values that has sustained the Jewish people for 3,000 years. Values like welcoming the stranger, dignity for all human beings, equality under the law, respect for decency, and respect for dissent, followed by love of the truth. No policy changes are worth giving up our values. We can be the new Jerusalem. We must protect our tree of life.
Okay, so thank you all for being here, and I'm going to take a step back now. I'm the Holocaust historian, and I teach about Holocaust history, but of course when you teach about Holocaust history, you can't not teach about the long history of anti-Semitism, because the Holocaust didn't come from nowhere, and the shootings in Squirrel Hill didn't come from nowhere either. So I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about kind of the long history of anti-Semitism, and then some scary things that are going on around the world in terms of anti-Semitism, because we have our, this terrible moment in the United States with the deadliest attack on Jews here, but unfortunately there are some places in Europe where attacks like this have been going on for the last 10 years and more. So I want to talk about anti-Semitism in general, and part of this also is to kind of make us all aware of some of the rhetoric that we all should be on the lookout for, because one of the major things that I think we're all becoming aware of is the way that words matter, and that hate speech often leads to hate crimes, right, and to physical violence, as in this case. So with that, so kind of a brief definition, anti-Semitism is often thought of, or has been termed by historians, the longest hatred, because we know Jews are Jewish religion is thousands of years old, and basically since the beginning of the Jewish religion was some form of anti-Jewish hatred. And so anti-Semitism in this most basic form is a hatred or prejudice toward Jews, often stemming from a status as a minority of some kind, as some kind of an other, or either the status of the other or perception as Jews as other. It's often taking the form of a negative idea of Jews as extraordinarily evil and powerful. And again, these are kind of rhetorical things we should all be thinking about in terms of what we're hearing today, that Jews, though a small minority, have excess power in the world that leads to a lot of hatred. That's the misperception. Anti-Semitism often pits us versus them, so Jews as the them, and whatever the culture is, in the case of this weekend, right, a kind of a white supremacist culture, also in Nazi Germany, a white supremacist Aryan, so-called Aryan culture, so us versus them. And anti-Semites often called for an eradication of the Jews, right? So this kind of rhetoric, obviously, that we saw during the Holocaust, that we saw carried out during the Holocaust, but also that we see in the perpetrator this past weekend and in some of the other graffiti we've seen, death to the Jews, Jews should die. And of course, sometimes this call for eradication shows up in forms of actual government policy that we've seen in the past. Something important about anti-Semitism that we all need to be aware of is that it doesn't remain the same. That anti-Semitism can rise or fall. We see that in the United States, periods of more and less intense anti-Semitism, also in Europe. The idea of what the Jew is, this kind of concept of the Jew, can also change. It's not always the same. It's not always the same kind of hatred. Sometimes it's religious, racial, or political, economic. And the nature of the perceived evil of the Jews can be different, and the agenda or solution of how to deal with that can be different, depending on time and place. So this part is really to call us attention to some of the most common tropes of anti-Semitism, because what we see today is there are some people who say death to the Jews, and this is very clearly hate speech, but sometimes other things are going on that are more subtle in terms of media discussions of Jews that sometimes function as dog whistles, that if you're in the know, you know, right? If you're anti-Semitic, you know what these things mean. If you're Jewish, you know what these things mean. But a lot of people, most people who aren't either one of those things, don't necessarily know. So some of the common tropes, kind of old forms of anti-Semitism, are those Jews as those who killed Jesus. That's one of the earliest, right? And if you believe that Jews killed Jesus based on biblical interpretation, then the Jews are evil. And Jews as child killers, and this can morph and change. It's not always the traditional, comes from the Middle Ages idea of blood libel, that Jews took children and Christian children and killed them for religious purposes. But there are all kinds of other ways. Any discussion of Jews using body parts for different nefarious means kind of refers back to these ideas of Jews as child killers. One of the most common, we're seeing this a lot right now, these stereotypes that Jews not just make money, but are incredibly greedy and then pull the strings of the world through their monetary economic influence. Jews are often seen as a racial or a sexual threat, as in Nazi Germany. Jews could be seen as culturally subversive, right, against a kind of European cultural norm. Jews are often thought of as strangers to the nation and therefore unworthy of being citizens, like what happened in Nazi Germany, somehow by nature never able to assimilate or to fit into the national narrative. And then since the Holocaust, another common trope, and this is what we see with the graffiti that we're seeing all over these days, is the linking of Jews and Nazis, calling Jews Nazis, calling them Hitler, or using kind of Nazi-related, usually swastikas, graffiti to incite fear and hostility against them. So I wanted to show you a few images, and these are, again, just depicting some of the major stereotypes. You have the guy with the yellow background with the coins in his hand demonstrate. Anytime you see money and you see Jews together in the same anything, basically it's referencing this kind of anti-Semitism of Jews as greedy. Here we have a Soviet imagery, which is a long-standing historical thing, which is less relevant for today, but this question of Jews and coins and money, obviously these are really horrifying, disgusting images of Jews as, evil predators, right? This idea that Jews are somehow predators. And then the bottom one, you have the Jewish kind of spider figure with its tentacles around the world. So again, playing on the idea, the fear that Jews are somehow very, very powerful, which plays into much of anti-Semitism the way we see it. So some of the results of all of these forms of anti-Semitism in the thousands of years of history have been social, economic, and political exclusion. So Jews not being allowed to do everything in society, from participating in the same jobs as others, non-Jews, to having educational opportunities, to having any role in government or representation in government systems. This has happened in every country, in every place that there have been Jews in history. There have been moments of massive expulsions of Jews, right, where the government of a place, especially in the Middle Ages, said, we have to get rid of these Jews, and got rid of them, pushed them out. So wholesale expulsions of Jews from countries, as in Spain, England, France. Forced conversion of Jews, right, to try to mitigate the supposed otherness of the Jews. There have been hundreds of years of pogroms, mob attacks against Jews in response to these kinds of stereotypes, leading to destruction of property and persons. And then finally, in terms of the Holocaust, obviously genocide, the final solution, so-called, to get rid of all Jews, and mass murder in various kinds. So, including what we've seen recently, so murder of Jews as a result of these stereotypes. So again, rhetoric leading to action. So just a last moment, in case we thought we were alone in murderous attacks against Jews in recent history, I have a few examples here in the last 10 years from Europe, in Moscow, Belgium, Germany, France, of murders of Jews in various numbers, shootings, stabbings, even attempts at gassing synagogues, individual assaults on Jewish people. And so it's a longer story, but there's a rise in anti-Semitism around the world right now, not just in the United States. And there are various reasons for this. Some of them we'll talk about in some of our other panels as well. There's been a recent rise of Islamic anti-Semitism that has motivated some attacks in France and Belgium. Rise of right-wing populism and nationalism, like we saw in the shootings in Squirrel Hill. This idea of racial superiority. This is also the case of the attacks in Moscow, a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric in Poland, Austria, and Germany. And there's also been a rise of left-wing anti-Semitism in official circles, especially in England. And I wrote this slide, and Jeremy Corbyn, if you're following, has been kind of very vocally anti-Semitic. And I saw this morning another statement that there were a number of British Labour Party groups like chapters of the Labour Party, who refused to call out anti-Semitism on this Squirrel Hill event, that they were willing to say, we condemn the attack, but not to bring up anti-Semitism, because I think the quote was something like, it's always anti-Semitism that. We need to stop talking about anti-Semitism. So there are a lot of reasons for this anti-Semitism around the world, and unfortunately, we are seeing the results of it everywhere right now. On that happy note, I will turn it over.
Hi, good evening. I want to thank everybody for being here, and to Yael for organising such a robust panel on such short notice. I've only been at MSU since August, but I have to say, seeing such a full room after just a few days of advertisements makes me feel like this is a really good place to be. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes today about an immigration organisation called HAIS, H-A-I-S. It was originally founded in 1881 as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is where those initials come from. Now, HAIS is relevant to this panel because, as many of you I'm sure will have heard, the Tree of Life community's support of HAIS's programs seem to have been an influencing factor in the selection of this community as the target for this attack. Shortly before the attack, the gunman Robert Bowers wrote a post on the unfiltered social media site Gab, stating that, quote, HAIS likes to bring in invaders to kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in, end quote. To Today, HIAS is an organization that assists refugees of all religions and ethnicities, but it was founded in 19th century America specifically to aid Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Between 1881 and 1924, over 2 million Eastern European and Russian Jews fled their native lands looking for safety on American shores. Throughout the 1880s, a series of violent anti-Semitic attacks, which were known as pogroms, tore through Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, forcing many to flee. Poverty and profound economic insecurity were also motivating factors for many of these immigrants to leave their homes, as well as formal restrictions placed on them by the government and forced conscription for young men into the military. While no formal legal status existed at the time, the Jews fleeing Eastern Europe were refugees. Most Jews came to the country with their families, intending to stay. So HIAS was founded in 1881 to help them do just that. It began as a simple shelter in a storefront on the Lower East Side, providing dormitory space, a soup kitchen, and clothing for needy Jews. A senior editor for The Atlantic magazine, Amy Weissmeyer, wrote a few days after the attack in Pittsburgh about how HIAS had been instrumental to her family's story in the United States. Her grandfather, Itzik Weissman, was born in the Ukraine and as a young man faced forced conscription into the Bolshevik military. Fleeing on foot across Romania, he made it to Pittsburgh in 1922, learned English, and Americanized his name to Isidore Weiss. He got a scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh and eventually became an accountant. Amy Weissmeyer remembered the tremendous opportunities afforded to her grandfather in the United States. The United States alone can't open a business, she wrote. The United States made my grandfather's story possible, she wrote. But opportunity alone can't open a business. It can't feed children or provide them with warm clothes to wear in winter. That requires money. The money that helped my grandfather's family settle in Pittsburgh came chiefly from one organization, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Another journalist, Masha Gessen, writing in the New Yorker last week, recalled how HIAS had been influential in their family's migration from the former Soviet Union in the 20th century. They wrote, "I heard HIAS, as it was pronounced in Russian, when I was 14, and my family was about to leave the Soviet Union. I suspect no one in my family knew what the acronym stood for, but we had somehow learned that HIAS would take care of us once we crossed the border." Back then, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee would help the newly stateless Jewish emigres from the USSR to pay for housing and expenses while they stayed in Italy on their way to the United States. HIAS would process the paperwork, obtaining visas that eventually allowed my family and tens of thousands of others to enter the United States as refugees. HIAS, since its founding in 1881, has helped Jewish newcomers to America with financial aid by connecting newly arrived immigrants to family members, by providing assistance with finding work and temporary housing, and by procuring legal assistance to help would-be immigrants who faced unexpected legal challenges when they tried to enter the country. HIAS has therefore played a role in the stories of many American Jewish families who trace their origins in this country to the Jews fleeing persecution in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It's not the only institution created in service of Jewish immigrants, but it can be justifiably regarded as one of the most influential in the American Jewish context. Today, HIAS has expanded its mission to serve refugees of all religions and none. As an organization, it works to identify people at risk and to assist them as they resettle in safety, working with local social service organizations in the US to help them welcome refugees and integrate into their new communities. As current HIAS President and CEO Mark Hetfield has written, HIAS's new mission is, quote, helping refugees not because they are Jewish, but because we are Jewish. On the Shabbat, the Sabbath before Bauer's attack, members of the Tree of Life Synagogue participated in Refugee Shabbat. Refugee Shabbat is an initiative of HIAS that provides synagogues with opportunities for ritual and for Jewish learning on the global refugee crisis that situates it in the context of the Jewish experience of being strangers in strange lands. As the booklet produced for this year's event was titled, My People Were Refugees Too. Each year at the Passover Seder, Jews read in their Haggadahs the words from the book of Exodus, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." According to the rabbis of the Talmud, a traditional religious text, The Torah admonishes Jews to remember the feeling of being a stranger and to treat other strangers well, no fewer than 36 times. No other commandment is repeated so often. In the days since the attack, journalists have reported on Bauer's hatred of refugees and immigrants, a hatred he shared liberally on far-right social media sites. His last post cited the Tree of Life community's support of Hayas and its Refugee Shabbat program as justification for his attack. By all indication, Robert Bowers was violently fixated on what he viewed as the pollution of white America by people from other countries. His anti-Semitic hate was trained particularly closely on Hayas, as he interpreted Hayas's work as contributing to that problem. Jews, for Bowers, were both part of the non-white problem, as well as, through Hayas, enablers of other non-whites entering America as immigrants. Now, Jews have, throughout their history in America, been the target of anti-Semitic hate speech, which has used these kinds of nativist tropes. There was nothing particularly original about Bowers' animus. He expressed clear hatred for anyone he regarded as foreign to white America as he understood it. The Tree of Life community, in his eyes, not only fell into this category, but actively enabled other migrants to come to this country as well. What began 2 weeks ago as a community of Jewish people sharing rituals and texts in which they remembered their own Jewish story of immigration in the context of contemporary refugees, thus led 1 week later to the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history. In the wake of the attack, Hayas has not shut down their operations. Quite the opposite, in fact. Over the past week, it has seen soaring fundraising campaigns originating in all corners of the United States. And all over the world, we've seen the question, what is Hayas, trending on Google and social media. So I'd like to close with an answer to this question that was provided by another American Jewish refugee, a journalist, Lev Galinkin, reflecting in last week's New York Times. He writes, "I first heard of those 4 letters, H-A-I-S, in 1989, when I was 9 years old and my family fled anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. At the time, we didn't know Hayas stood for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or that it had been helping migrant Jews since 1881. All we knew was to head for the main train station in Vienna, where, rumor had it, people who worked for this strange acronym would help. For the next 6 months, Hayas became the most important entity in my life. It was Hayas workers who were pulling us and tens of thousands of others off the trains in Austria. Hayas that got us settled in refugee camps. Hayas that rallied American Jewish communities to sponsor refugees in the United States. Hayas will help, I silently intoned, as we hitchhiked like phantoms across Austrian roads and went through awful asylum interviews at the American embassy. Hayas was what remained when the rest of your life had disintegrated, when there was no money, no way to communicate, no going back. Hayas was what kept you tethered to the world when you became a ghost but weren't yet ready to die. What does Hayas mean today? To refugees around the world, it's become an international word for hope, in dozens of tongues and for numerous faiths. It's easy to see how Hayas stands for everything white supremacists hate: tolerance, understanding, and empathy. But to me, it symbolizes America and Judaism at its best.
All right. Okay, really, I'm completely confident. It's all good. Okay. All right. All right, well, I want to echo thanks that everyone has been giving for everyone coming here. Actually, standing up, I can see so many more people. It's really amazing. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I also want to say something that I've said to my students, and I see a number of them in the audience, so thank you all especially for coming. So I've been teaching American Jewish history on campus for 17 years. And I told my students last Monday that I was not prepared for this, and I have never taught it before. I have never taught anti-Semitism and hate groups in the 20th century US, which was a way of apologizing to my students that I didn't prepare them to be thinking about what happened, and it was also a check on myself and a rethinking of how I think about my work. And I actually have just, as Yael said, I just published a work on modern anti-Semitism, but it did not include hate groups, nor hate speech, nor hate violence in any real way. And so what I give you now, I wanted to talk about this, but it is very early in my own understanding of it. I think a lot of people have overlooked this element of American Jewish history. And I'm really quite sad that that is no longer going to be the case. So anyway, what I want to give you is just a fast overview and kind of a way of thinking about some of the historical context for what happened last Monday. Last Saturday, I apologize. And I'm really glad and grateful to my colleague Laura for offering the exact words of the Pittsburgh shooter for coming into a synagogue, shooting 11 people, and seeing them as invaders who were bringing in other outside groups that they saw as dangerous. That is, I'm going to sort of make 3 major points for you that I think are significant that will tie what happened on last Saturday to earlier events and activities and people and organizations. So anti-Semitism has been part of a broader history of hate in the 20th century against Jews and others. And so it has both talked about Jews as others, as Laura said really well, and has also seen them as vehicles for bringing in others, for endangering the American civilization or nation by bringing in others, African Americans, Latinos, immigrants. And so I'm going to give a little bit of a way of seeing this broader history of hate in different decades. There's also an intersection between hate groups, hate speech, and violence. I have actually spoken, I did once lecture about hate speech if I need to sort of offer that. I have done that, but I haven't really talked about it in the ways that it's intersected with hate groups and violence. And I think that the occasion on Saturday makes me rethink and encourages, I think, us all to rethink, even if this person was a lone person, he was not just getting stuff out of thin air. He was reading things, and those things were put out by organizations, and that has happened throughout the 20th century. There hasn't been an internet or social media throughout the 20th century, and so organizations were perhaps more important earlier because they had to be producing things. They had to be putting out books and pamphlets and things like that. They needed access to a printing press, and so it looked a little bit different, but nonetheless, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of continuities. And then the third thing that I want to sort of leave you with, and there's a lot of ways to explore this, and this is the thing I'm most hesitant about, but I would really encourage you to think about it, is government responses that have shifted over time. And they've shaped the successes and the failures of this hatred. So if we want to think about both the environment in which Robert Bowers did what he did, and also the responses to what he did, I think it's important to consider the way the US government has responded to past experiences like this, and why this is happening now, and what we might think about as a potential, not a solution, but a potential response. So I'm going to do something that historians usually don't do, which is go a little bit unchronologically. I'm going to go through each one of these themes through decades, and then I'm going to go to the next theme. So the first thing I want to do is just the 1920s. So there's a difference a little bit in thinking about the origins of this, and we've already heard about sort of an earlier origin, and I may be talking too long, so I'm going to try and go more quickly. So you can see some real origins in the 1920s. Anyone want to guess what decade this is, with the Ku Klux Klan marching on the Capitol? Is the 1920s. There is a growth of a second KKK. The first KKK is during Reconstruction, post-Civil War, and is predominantly about African Americans and the right to vote. But in the second KKK, it is directed towards immigrants and Jews and Catholics. And they clearly are intimidating, and they take on real government power in the 1920s. They become senators and governors in various Midwestern states. It's also no longer Southern. So that is sort of an early modern hate group that is training its eyes on Jews. And then you also see sort of the emergence of sort of this dominant trope that we talked about, this kind of political vision of Jews, both as others and also as encouraging the dominance of other others. In Henry Ford's work, The Dearborn Independent, when I'm with students and I have more time, we read, students here who've been in my class before will recognize this quotation, where we take apart the belief that popular music is a Jewish monopoly, jazz is a Jewish creation, the mush, slush, sly suggestion, abandoned sensuousness of sliding notes are of Jewish origin. Basically, assuming, and throughout the Dearborn Independent, Ford both takes beliefs about Jewish conspiracies to take over a Christian civilization and links them very much to African-American music, African-American popular culture, and suggests that Jews are not only taking over because of their money, but they are also taking over by bringing in these non-Christian, non-white voices and making them dominant into American popular culture. This is very successful. It is spread throughout the country, it is ultimately shut down, but not really. He stops publication, but he doesn't really apologize and is never really held to accountability for spreading this hatred that has lasting impact in the U.S. And then by the 1930s, you see this grounding of hatred flourishing in hate groups all over the country. This is New Jersey. This is the German-American Bund. It was a pro-Nazi group that existed throughout the country, had real power, and not real power, it didn't take political power, but they made shows like this in New York, LA, various places throughout the country. You can see not only are they marching, but you can see people Sig Heiling in the audience. This is near where I grew up. And so you see an explosion of pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, quasi-fascist hate groups in the US. They are funded, some of them, by the German government. They do not take on significant power, but they have followers, and they are scary. And they are quite visible in both, out in New Jersey and then in major cities. And here's where I'm going to skip. And then, and I should say that, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know how to go backwards. How do I go backwards? Oh, that's probably too complicated. Okay, that's not going to work. All right, I'm not going to go backwards. We're just going to move forward. We're going on. And it's worth saying that in the 1930s, that ideology is both about Jews as invaders. It's also about them as socialists. It is also about them aiding the cause of African Americans as well as themselves. And you can see the same thing happening in the 1950s. This is a pamphlet that was circulated by one of a number of Christian groups. As many as 40 in the middle of the civil rights freedom struggle in the 1950s, particularly pushed by Brown versus Board of Education. There are many groups that see Jews as responsible for the civil rights movement. There is a belief among many Southern whites that their own African-American citizens are happy, and so it must be outside invading Jewish forces, probably from the Northeast, who are actually creating race mixing, who are bringing in all the problems of civil rights. You can see, you may not be able to read this all the way to the end, but nobody's mentioned yet the attacks on George Soros as a really dominant anti-Semitic trope that is now circulating. And down at the bottom of this, a Jew, Julius Rosenwald, spent $30 million financing organizations and writers that promote mongrelization. A race once mongrelized is mongrelized forever. So you see the exact same thing, right? You see the exact same targeting of a wealthy, prominent Jew as being responsible for the racial degradation of the society. And some of this, it's worth saying, is because Jews were active in the civil rights movement, and they were actually active as lawyers and activists. It is also because of this image of them as shadowy outsiders who were dangerous and different as both others and invaders, and aiding others, invaders, nationalists. I'm just giving you some names that we should do. In terms of thinking about the points that I made about intertwining hate and violence, in 1930s, this is the 1930s anti-Nazi protest in LA, Jewish groups intercepted multiple plots to kill Jews in the LA community. There's actually been 2 books out about this recently. There were also multiple attacks on Jews in a very sort of localized kind of gang way throughout New York and Boston and other parts of the country. So there are absolutely, even as this is expression of hatred, it also inspires violence, both by Nazis and by anti-Nazis, and there are a lot of clashes on city streets. And then in the 1950s, there are multiple efforts. There are multiple synagogues throughout the South that are the targets of bombing attempts. This is one of the most successful. This is the Temple in Atlanta. The rabbi is featured here. He was actually from Squirrel Hill. I don't know if you know that. This was a rabbi who was very outspoken in civil rights support, and the synagogue was targeted because of his civil rights support. He came back a few weeks later, I believe, and gave a sermon that said, "We are not afraid." This is, again, to sort of let you know, this is an effort by hate groups to target Jews in particular with violence, as well as African Americans. And that is worth noting, that this is all going on in the context of much greater and larger violence towards African Americans, but it is about targeting white Jews as an entry to that. Okay, and then the final thing to bring up is government responses. And this is the thing that I am most hesitant about, but also the thing that I really want you to think about as you walk out the door, which is that in the 1930s, Nazis and fascist groups were labeled un-American. They were investigated by House committees, and they were ultimately shut down. This was in part because they were actually propounding, they hated the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was, once World War II started, he was more than happy to see them as un-American and see them put out of business. But it is worth noting that government allows things to flourish or shuts them down. In the 1950s, segregationists blamed Jews for the blasts. That's what this image is. It is worth noting that both that much of the violence against African Americans was permitted to continue and exist unabated. But when this bombing was turned against Jews, it actually created political momentum for a Civil Rights Act. People were horrified by this violence, and they actually acted upon it. And then there's today. Hatred of Jews is still strongly tied to that of others. That should not be surprising, but it is worth us thinking about and remembering and keeping with us. Hate speech put out by hate groups is still clearly connected to violence. And this is a question. We have a flourishing of anti-Semitic violence, and we, far from having people in the government speaking out about it, we have either silence or retweeting of it, and that is worth thinking about and thinking about letting it continue or stopping it. That's all I want to say. Thank you for listening.
Since I'm not doing a PowerPoint, I'm just going to stand here. Is this a good volume? Because I'm pretty loud. So, okay. I first wanted to again mention this outpouring of support that I was mentioning in the introduction. And just recently we saw that as well with a lot of large African American churches linking with the synagogues and programming this week, with over $200,000 being raised by Muslim charities in the United States. And what was most poignant to me this week was a father of one of my sons who plays soccer with him. When I was in line kind of getting him from school, he walked out and kind of said how horrible this event was and how he was thinking about me, which really touched me if you think about how many people are being killed in Yemen every day in a civil war and a proxy war, and millions of people being on the verge of starvation, that he kind of got out of his car and reached out in this way. I think following up on a little bit what Professor Amy Simon and Kirsten Vermeglish were saying in terms of traditional tropes that Professor Simon was talking about, and then what Professor Vermeglish was emphasizing in terms of hate groups in the United States, which are largely on the right. And I wanted to caution us that even though I think the focus should legitimately be on hate groups from the right, who I think are the most dangerous in the United States and have caused the most death and probably will, that we really have to also raise awareness about anti-Semitism that comes from both the extreme right and the extreme left. And I think that part of the danger of that is that in both extremes, it's kind of creeping into a larger right and a larger left from the fringes and becoming kind of more part of a legitimate conversation that is no longer quite fringe, as Kirsten was quite well suggesting in terms of perhaps some of our mainstream politicians allowing and enabling that to happen as well. And so I think we have to be concerned about the danger of that and not calling that out and be aware of recognizing it and calling it out, whatever ideology it comes from. And also because hate speech can turn into violence and killing on all ends. And so when you look at what kind of sometimes is in common at the extreme right and extreme left that seems to be growing, is in common seems to be at times a use of rhetoric and images that call or are reminiscent of these old traditional historical anti-Semitic tropes, and often are variations on them. Now some of it is just kind of but it's the depiction of Jews as evil or satanic or all-powerful and behind nefarious policies and not belonging that you hear from both the extreme right and extreme left these days. A recent article that I was just reading this week was kind of suggesting that the anti-Semitism in the United States is largely a product of this nativism that has been brought up by several of my friends and colleagues. And while the anti-Semitism in Britain, as I think Professor Amy Simon brought up, is largely associated with kind of a virulent anti-Zionism that sometimes veers into anti-Semitism. And I would like to suggest that actually both are alive and well in the United States, even though they have varied variations in different continents and countries. And so, as a chair in Israel Studies on campus, I also want to bring up kind of when and how do we know and raise questions as to is there a line, what crosses a line between kind of legitimate criticism of Israel on one hand, and when does it veer into raising questions of whether it flirts with anti-Semitism or crosses into those tropes on the other hand. And so I want to make very clear that, of course, it's very legitimate to criticize Israeli policies. In fact, most Israelis criticize many, many Israeli policies, as do many American Jews criticize many, many Israeli policies and many American policies. And so that, and certainly I think all of us on this panel are highly critical of certain Israeli policies. And so that, and I'd be happy to talk about it in my classes in different ways and critical ways of analyzing this, but I'd be happy to talk about that after a while. So first I want to make that very, very clear, right? It's perfectly legitimate to vehemently criticize, angrily criticize various policies. But how do we know, and I'm not here to give answers or point fingers, but rather raise questions as to when it might kind of become problematic. And I think part of it is, again, if it is couched in a terminology or image that is associated with some of the things that have been brought up by my colleagues. And often it's brought up without any kind of ill intention, so I'm not pointing at figures and trying to call out different people as anti-Semites, but rather people of goodwill or that don't have ill intention, who may not be aware of these tropes and their influence, and so unconsciously maybe associating themselves or flirting with these things without necessarily having the intention to do that, but one might have sometimes the effect of doing that. And so some of the language that traditionally looks at Jews, that kind of wishes there'd be a world without Jews, it raises questions if someone is saying, we wish to be a world without Israel, or the only country that shouldn't exist in the world is Israel, or the only member of the United Nations that shouldn't exist in Israel. It doesn't mean someone's anti-Semitic, but it raises a question, is kind of the way Jews were being treated now being kind of legitimized if you're talking about the Jewish state or Jewish majority state as opposed to Jews in general. And while sometimes Jews were referred to or are referred to as evil or as the pariah, is the Jewish state now in its place seen as evil or as a pariah? And some of the ways that have been suggested, there are some kind of even German cities that have said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The current UN Secretary General says that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think the collective University of California schools now basically say that anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. I'm not going that far. I think it's possible to be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semite, and we might talk about that. However, one has to be very careful when one is demonizing or delegitimizing or using double standards in Israel, because it raises questions, right, as to what's behind that and what's coloring that. And also efforts to kind of isolate Israel of all the 194 countries in the world and try to isolate it and punish it only, as is the case in some places and movements. One question is, in order to do that, in order to kind of single Israel out in that way, are you almost incumbent on not only criticizing harshly, but veering into and encouraging demonization? Because how would you, or on what basis would you single it out of all the countries in the United Nations if it's not worse than all the other countries in the United Nations, and therefore not just violating human rights, but committing genocide and being evil and being a monster who almost happily likes killing children, right? And that goes back to the blood libel of Jews kind of almost enjoying killing children and sucking the blood of those children, and some of the cartoon images you have is reminiscent of that. So what are some of the tropes that we should be conscious of or aware of? One is that blood libel, that Israel's accused of not only committing human rights violations, but committing genocide. So the people that were victims of genocide are actually committing genocide on purpose, intentionally, and trying to exterminate another people. That somehow they're all-powerful and nefarious influence on U.S. politics and foreign policy. So again, the Jews, the Jewish lobby, etc., they're the cause of all the ill in the Middle East. They're the cause of not only policies related to Israel and Palestine, but for the Iraq War, etc. And it goes beyond kind of the strong influence and negative influence that Jews have. And they've also been seen as the spear of kind of imperialism and colonialism, and almost the prime example of that in the world, which of course has all these very negative connotations of having worldwide power, of Jews not belonging not only as a minority in different countries, but not belonging in the Middle East either. And so all these kind of things feed into these other kind of tropes, and therefore one could have a legitimate conversation as to the complexities of the situation and where Jews went wrong, or where Jews are to blame, or where Israel to blame, and you can do that. But when you only see it as a imperialist, colonialist, genocidal, evil state, then you may not look at the complexity and also look at the fact that it's also a post-colonial state established by victims of genocide and prejudice, and who also have indigenous claims and so forth, right? So when I tell my students, it's often a story of right versus right as opposed to right versus wrong, and that's what makes it the most tragic thing in the world, that you don't have to pick what's good and bad, but try to empathize with the legitimate claims of all peoples. So I think that these different discussions, both on the extreme right and the extreme left, what do they cause us to do? They, at the very least, cause us to be suspicious of Jews, right? Either suspicious of Jews on the right in terms of where they belong and whether they're aiding these causes that the right doesn't believe with, or on the left, suspicious, right? Suspicious are almost half the Jews living in Israel? Are they Zionists? Is that a horrible, evil thing to be? Are most other Jews kind of supporting of that, and therefore most Jews are under suspicion of some kind at least? Or does it, at the more dangerous level, actually lead to violence? And so, for instance, there was a panel here a few years ago that I participated in on Ferguson in Paris, and there was a faculty member on the panel who was not from MSU, who was in a way almost justifying the killings at the deli in Paris that were brought up today by saying, look, they were killing Zionists. Now, of course, the killer did not ask the Jews whether they were Zionists or not, but the assumption is that perhaps, you know, there are good Jews and bad Jews, and it's okay to kill the bad Jews. So the almost 50% of Jews worldwide that now live in Israel, they maybe deserve to be killed, and maybe the many other Jews who support or even critically support the existence of Israel, even though they heavily criticize many of its policies, maybe they're associated with it and sort of deserve it too, and therefore you essentially end up having a problem with most Jews in the world. And if you have a problem with most Jews in the world, doesn't that sound like prejudice? It sounded that way to me. So I think that we have to have legitimate discussion of these things, which I do in all my classes and other forums, but we also have to be aware of, is there something in the air here that is legitimating a kind of suspicion at minimum and a much more dangerous legitimization of demonization that happens of Jews on the extreme right and extreme left. So I invite us to do that. And now my friend and colleague and mentor, Ken Waltzer, who is great at thinking through these things. So.
Can I be heard? Yep. It's maybe a little too early for us to discern the full meaning of what took place in Pittsburgh just a short time ago. What happened was a unique event. We know from the media, particularly from the ADL initially, that it was the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history. Something like this raises the question whether something has changed or will change or is changing in America, in the American Jewish condition. But the point I want to make, and it's pretty much in line with what Laura and Kirsten were saying, that it's in our response to such events over time, and it's what we make of it and how we act against it that we create ourselves anew and contribute to whatever is the American Jewish condition. We've all grown used to the resurgent anti-Semitism in Europe and to the state and popular responses there to the threat. We know about military guards at synagogues and schools, and we know about accumulating exodus, particularly from France. In European cities in the last 4 years, masses have marched and shouted, "Hitler didn't complete the job. Jews to the gas." Terrorists have targeted Jews in the grocery stores, we know. Criminal gangs have targeted lonely Holocaust survivors and widows and women in their apartments. Jewish life continues in Europe, but it's a guarded life, a crimped life. And obviously we all think about, is that going to be the condition here? In comparative perspective, the Jewish experience in America has been more benign and salutary than what has happened in Europe. Once an immigrant people, still a distinctive minority people clustered in certain suburban and urban neighborhoods, and prominent and selected industries not evenly distributed over the American economy. American Jews have become, in this place, in this America, successful, integrated in various distinctive ways, well-educated, remarkably well-educated, and accomplished. Presidential families seek to intermarry with Jews. Will America continue to be such an exceptional place? That seems to be the question. It's also at the same time that event an unsurprising event. The sharpening political divisions in the contemporary U.S., the dysfunctions of our polity in helping us cope with relatively huge changes, economic, political, social, demographic, the new technologies which permit us to build up and disseminate hate online, that shape our relations, the drift away under our politics of the American political economy from a mixed economy and a welfare state with a set of assumptions that we have obligations to one another and should care for one another, and the drifts of American sentiment away from the egalitarian and multicultural values of the civil rights and immigration reform eras. All these things contributed to the conditions where a lone gunman, a neo-Nazi right-wing anti-Semite, couldn't be more clear, and an opponent of immigrants and refugees could attack and massacre worshipers on Sabbath at the Tree Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. The Jews there were attacked and killed because they were liberal on issues like immigrants and refugees. They followed the commitment to care for the stranger. They were killed because the radical white supremacists and nationalists who have grown in recent years and have come out into public in recent years, and these people influenced David Bowers, believe that Jews are not white. They say it in their materials. And they believe Jews are the catalysts and the instigators of all the things that threaten to displace them. Bowers went through synagogue saying his intention was to kill all the Jews. His motive was clear. On his profile on Gab, he wrote, "Jews are the children of Satan." So the connection of his anti-Semitism to the ancient anti-Semitism that Amy talked about is also clear. In addition, he also wrote about this being a critical time in history. It's not that just Jews are bad, but this is the moment. This is the critical time in history. Things must be done now. In addition, in this new era, we found, watching Pittsburgh, that it no longer takes a village or a mob to commit a pogrom. It just takes one guy with an armed automatic rifle and a few pistols. So possibly we are looking at this event and taking from it the meaning that we live in a new America, a new era, and perhaps we do. That right anti-Semitism that we know from the past, that wreaked such havoc just 2 generations ago, racialist, viewing the Jew as a pariah and as a conspiratorial danger, is back amongst us. And we never know when individually we or our children will confront it. It's part of life now. It's part of when your kids go to school. It's part of when they go out on their own. What's going to happen? It's clear that our Jewish institutions need safeguarding and protecting from this danger. We would be irresponsible not to take up that challenge. So this past weekend, many synagogues and schools hardened their infrastructures, installing metal detectors at entrances and ramping up the employment of private guards, so that soon we will look more like the European picture. Those of us with an interest in American higher education, Cindy, I'm sorry about this, we have to also wonder about Hillel, which brings Jewish kids together on campus and clusters them, and unfortunately makes them a target. What to do? Our concern and our heightened attention must not run away with ourselves. We shouldn't overstate the danger, upsetting as all of it is, because the reaction of so many people in Pittsburgh is probably the reaction of so many Americans, to identify with the victims and the survivors, not with the killers. It's absolutely clear, and the people of Pittsburgh helped us understand that. Nonetheless, the danger is real. There are many angry and disoriented people that provide a social base for such white nationalism, and for whom white nationalism speaks to their fears of displacement. And our present politics, to repeat what Kirsten was arguing, provides more than a disinterested accommodation with the development. We have a president who trades on the tropes and themes of white nationalism. It's been clear throughout the 2 years. Who appropriates some images and stories of classical racial anti-Semitism, even though he has Jews in his family, and who stirs intergroup division while also glorifying violence. That's what's new about the current new America. The new America is Trump's America. But perhaps in the wake of the killing and the remarkable broad participation of Jews nationally with their neighbors, in grieving openly and commemorating the victims, American Jews will, instead of fearing about a new America, find renewed hope and purpose in responding to that new America. It's always been the case, thinking about identity, that we shape our identity in response to disasters, in response to challenges. This is a moment rich in worry, but it's also a moment rich in the possibility of remaking ourselves. Perhaps Jews will find new strength in their own solidarity and preparedness, in their own renewed commitment to continuing on. Perhaps Jews may find new strength and positive outcomes in their broad affirmation of a politics dedicated to protecting and extending equal rights for all, offering reasonable access by strangers to our community and citizenship, and providing minimum standards of life for all Americans. That's also our opportunity now. Boy, I'm thinking about tomorrow. Perhaps they may find strength in alliance and fellowship with many other people who are also worried about the new America, and who are also victims of the new conditions that face us all. Above all, what I know, and what I want to conclude with, is that the American Jewish condition will be shaped as much by what we do now as it will be by the terror of Pittsburgh. Thanks.
Most of us academics did not, including myself, stay to the 7, we could have been at 11, so we have less time for